This is RT coming to you live from Moscow with me, Yulia Shapovalova, and we start with breaking news this hour. Hugo Chavez, the long-standing president of Venezuela, has died after a long battle with cancer. He'd suffered a series of health complications following his return from cancer treatment in Cuba. Chavez had been president of Venezuela for 14 years and was re-elected again last October. So tributes have been coming in from international figures. Ex-President Jimmy Carter applauded him for his bold assertion of autonomy, while Russia's UN envoy described his death as a tragedy. But amid the sadness, there has been anger as Venezuela's vice president accused the country's historical enemies of having a hand in his death. And while inside the country, Maduro ordered the military and police onto the streets to ensure security. That's after meeting with security officials and regional leaders. And that comes after the country expelled 2 U.S. officials for allegedly trying to undermine the health of the president. And RT's Marina Portnay is joining us now live from New York with the latest. Marina, hello. So tell us more about the announcement.
Well, according to reports, President Hugo Chavez died around 16:25, that's 4:45 p.m. Caracas time, at a military hospital. Now, Venezuelan Vice President Nicolas Maduro, accompanied by senior ministers, announced that President Chavez had passed, describing the news as a moment of deep pain. Now, the country's national armed forces also pledged their unconditional allegiance to Vice President Maduro. Chavez, before he passed many weeks ago, said that when the time would come, he would like for Maduro to be his successor. Now, according to the country's constitution, the head of the Venezuelan parliament, Diosdado Cabello, assumes the interim presidency until the elections. Now, the vote for the new president should be held within the next 30 days and will likely pit Vice President Maduro against Enrique Capriles, the opposition leader and state governor who lost to Chavez in the October election. One recent opinion poll gave Maduro a strong lead, enjoying much support among many of the working class. Capriles, in the meantime, flew over to the United States over the weekend, visiting Miami and New York. Author and journalist Eva Gollinger says it's no coincidence that during a time of instability in Venezuela, the opposition leader from that country is attending meetings in the United States.
This has been also typical over the past few years, over the past decade, really, of members of the opposition in Venezuela frequently coming to the United States to meet with their either financiers, because they get multi-million-dollar funding from the U.S. government and its different agencies, or from its allies, their allies here in the United States. Primarily members of former administrations, the Bush administration, but also the actual administration. And clearly, Enrique Capriles, who is coming to the United States, to Miami, to New York, to meet with these individuals to discuss the future of Venezuela, if you want to put it that way.
Yes, and what about the consequences of Chavez's death? Because we assume that Vice President Maduro will take the oath of office shortly. And what about international reverberations as well?
Well, this headline has become a national and international headline. Chavez was one of the world's best-known socialist leaders and a staunch critic of the United States. Chavez never held back on criticizing what he called the imperialistic motives of the West. He ruled his country, a country with the world's largest oil reserves, for 14 years. He was a powerful player in the world of geopolitics. I could tell you, when he was visiting New York City for the annual United Nations General Assembly debate, everybody anticipated that his speech, the international body, would be one that made headlines, because he never held back. He never minced his words. He always took on a challenge, and he clearly was not intimidated to take on the United States and its Western allies. Of course, Venezuela and the United States didn't have good diplomatic relations. There's been comments coming from Washington with officials expressing that maybe in the future now the U.S. and Venezuela might have better diplomatic relations. But Hugo Chavez, whether you loved him or hate him, he leaves enormous big shoes to fill. And for that, we go to RT's Lucy Kafanov.
A military man known to many as El Comandante.
Yes, it's a good one. It's going to work very well.
a politician devoted to promoting Venezuela's role as a key player on the world stage. Often a singer, sometimes a dancer, occasionally a joker.
Some people think I'm unable to speak in public for less than 5 hours.
Who held back no punches from his foes.
Yesterday, the devil came out here. Right here. And it smells of sulfur still today.
Hugo Chavez may have had many faces, but it is certain that he was one of the most outspoken and influential leaders of the 21st century. The world first met him as a young paratrooper with a tank. His 1992 coup attempt was doomed to fail, but his dream of a radical leftist revolution was not. Despite a brief prison stint for his actions, Chavez went on to run for president of Venezuela in 1998, winning the vote and assuming office in 1999. Under him, Venezuela went from being a major U.S. ally governed by and for the ruling class to a test case for the Chavez experiment with 21st century socialism. That meant nationalizing key sectors of the oil-rich nation's economy and pouring billions into welfare and social programs to help the previously marginalized poor. Chavez helped slash poverty rates, drive down unemployment, and reduce income inequality, winning die-hard supporters among the impoverished. But his Venezuela was also one of the most corrupt nations on earth, with a murder rate exceeding that of Iraq. Charges of authoritarianism, suppressing the judiciary, and silencing the press dogged Chavez throughout his presidency. Opponents fought to remove Chavez from power, including a 2002 coup attempt and a 2004 recall referendum. But he remained, winning another term in office in the 2012 election after facing the toughest electoral battle of his career. In his foreign policy, Chavez spearheaded the creation of today's anti-imperialist left-leaning bloc in Latin America, working to promote his vision of a multipolar world. He allied with Russia to develop energy contracts, financial arrangements, as well as arms deals, and made sure that subsidized oil flowed freely to allies like Cuba, Belarus, Nicaragua, and Syria. But it wasn't all smooth sailing when it came to his dealings with the West. Chavez was known to donate free heating oil to poor Americans, but had little love for their government. Relations have ranged from tense to outright hostility.
The devil who tries to dominate the world. Venezuela is independent and free and will never be a North American colony.
But in 2011, Chavez took up a new battle, the fight for his life against cancer. But just before the new year, and after 4 operations in Cuba, Chavez named his vice president as the preferred political heir. The final war waged by El Comandante.
Venezuela's founding father, Simón Bolívar, was a hero in Latin America's push for independence. For Hugo Chavez, he was the inspiration for a populist revolution and a push to bring about a new world order. Revered by some, reviled by others, it is undeniable that Chavez and his Bolivarian revolution left a permanent mark on this country, this region, and the world. Lucy Kafanov, RT, Caracas, Venezuela.
And to find more on these events, we're now joined live by geopolitical analyst Eric Dreitzer. Eric, very nice to have you on the program. So with Chavez gone, will the regional bloc he helped create with countries like Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua survive?
I think it very much can and will survive. The most obvious reason, of course, is because there are other very strong and charismatic leaders in that bloc. If we were to look just at the ALBA organization, we see President Correa in Ecuador, who just won a resounding electoral victory a couple of weeks ago. We see President Morales in Bolivia. We see President Ortega in Nicaragua, and other leaders emerging throughout the region that I think really cements not just the power and the prestige of the ALBA bloc, but in many ways it's an integral part of Chavez's legacy for the entire region beyond just Venezuela.
Now, what will be Washington's next move in the region now that one of its principal opponents is gone?
Well, Washington's subversion of Venezuela is likely to ratchet up. I think that the United States understands full well that despite his lack of charisma in comparison to Chavez, that Maduro is in many ways a very, very popular figure in Venezuela and one who would naturally win election in the new presidential elections were it not for meddling from the United States. You know, this is something that we saw in the run-up to the previous election where Chavez soundly defeated Capriles Radonsky. We saw plans in motion for the subversion of those elections. This was something that was demonstrated quite clearly by former U.S. ambassadors in the region and in particular in Venezuela who talked about scenarios for destabilizing a Chavez government. I think this is very much the blueprint for what the United States would like to achieve now in a post-Chavez Venezuela, a destabilization that delegitimizes the Maduro government and props up a possible Capriles government, one which would serve U.S. interests undoubtedly.
Right. Chavez inspired regional powerhouses like Argentina and Brazil to take a step to the left. Will that momentum hold after his death?
Well, again, I think that the momentum of the various countries is difficult to determine. Some countries are more closely aligned to the United States than others. Argentina, for instance, is engaged in multiple legal battles with the United States and with U.S. corporations. Argentina is emerging out of the wake of the IMF oppression under which they were dominated for many years. On the other side, though, Brazil is in a very different situation, seen as an emerging economy, part of the BRICS bloc, and so forth. So I think that the situations and circumstances of the various countries will determine just how far to the left they're willing to move and whether or not they'll be able to continue in the direction that Chavez had charted for them.
What do you make of the accusations from Caracas of foul play in Chavez's death there?
Well, I think that this and I know that other people have mentioned this as well, that it was indeed suspicious, not only the way in which and the speed with which Chavez deteriorated in this fight against cancer, but it was suspicious in the way in which the United States was acting, the way in which the United States had sent in multiple subversion forces into Venezuela last summer and before that. I think there's definite suspicion on this front, though no concrete evidence has been produced to this point, certainly something for investigation.
Yes, and what about a successor? You mentioned it earlier, but many have said that the new Bolivarian revolution was actually held together only by Chavez's charisma. So will Vice President Maduro be able to fill those shoes?
Well, I don't think that any one individual is going to be able to fill the incredibly large shoes that Chavez leaves, but I do think that there are coming generation of leaders inspired by and brought up in the Chavista system. And I think that the hope of all people, peace-loving people around the world and anti-imperialists around the world, the hope is that the progress that was made under the Chavez government has now been institutionalized, that it was not simply held together by the power of the character of Chavez, but rather that it is now forming the bedrock of Venezuela, and that Venezuelan politics and institutions will be forever shaped by Chavez rather than simply held together by him.
All right, geopolitical analyst Eric Drater. Eric, thank you very much indeed, and we do apologize for some sound problems there.
Thank you.
Caracas time at a military hospital. Now, Venezuelan Vice President Nicolas Maduro, accompanied by senior ministers, announced that President Chavez had passed, describing the news as a moment of deep pain. Now, the country's national armed forces also pledged their unconditional allegiance to Vice President
in Cuba. Chavez had been president of Venezuela for 14 years and was re-elected again last October. So tributes have been coming in from international figures. Ex-President Jimmy Carter applauded him for his bold assertion of autonomy, while Russia's UN envoy described his death as a tragedy. This is RT coming to you live from Moscow with me, Yulia Shapovalova, and we start with breaking news this hour. Hugo Chavez, the long-standing president of Venezuela, has died after a long battle with cancer. He suffered a series of health complications following his return from cancer treatment to U.S. officials for allegedly trying to undermine the health of the president. And RT's Marina Portnay is joining us now live from New York with the latest. Marina, hello. So tell us more about the announcement.
Well, according to reports, President Hugo Chavez died around 16:25. That's 4:45 p.m.
But amid the sadness, there has been anger as Venezuela's vice president accused the country's historical enemies of having a hand in his death. And while inside the country, Maduro ordered the military and police onto the streets to ensure security. That's after meeting with security officials and regional leaders. And that comes after the country expelled two